Welcome back. In this tutorial, we're going to talk more about MIDI and specifically how you can chain synthesizers together using MIDI. Also, how these synthesizers can communicate with each other, as well as details about the actual MIDI specification and how all this actually works. How does MIDI actually work? Let's say we have a synthesizer. My drawings are going to be as amazing as usual. So now we have three synthesizers and we want to chain or link them together so that by playing one keyboard we can actually trigger and play these other two. The MIDI specification allows for three different ways to connect your MIDI synthesizers. They are MIDI in, MIDI out, and developed slightly later was a port called a MIDI through port. So to actually connect these three synthesizers together, then what we would do is we would come out of the MIDI out port here and go into the MIDI in port. And then come out the MIDI out port and through the MIDI in port. So out into the in, come out the out into the in, thereby chaining these three synthesizers together in series. Each time one of these MIDI cables plugged into the input, this data would come into the synthesizer. Let me diagram it down here, a little larger version. So this is this synth right here. So the MIDI in would come right here. Essentially what happened, it would come down here to the motherboard or CPU, whatever you want to call it, the main processing or electronic circuitry of the synthesizer. It would process that MIDI in data and then it would send it back out the MIDI out port and onto this next synth over here. The problem with this is that each time you have a piece of electronic equipment or a CPU process data at all, something occurs called latency. Common term for latency is delay. It's how much time is added because of this processing that's going on right here. So latency in musical terms isn't a good thing. We don't want latency. If you're recording or if you're triggering synthesizers via MIDI, latency is not a good thing. So what you would have is you would have this synthesizer play, and then this synthesizer would receive the data, process a little bit, and there would be a little bit of a delay, maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 milliseconds, and then come over to this synthesizer, and there may be a little bit more delay here. So each time you add a synth, you're adding some delay. So instead of an immediate reaction where you get all three sounds of all three synthesizers happening at once, what you got was this kind of thing, where there was a delay or there was latent behavior by the second and third synthesizer. They were slow to react because they were waiting for this processing to occur here. The early developers of MIDI realized this as well. And so what they did was they developed a MIDI through port. The MIDI through port was slightly different than a MIDI in and out configuration. And this is how it would work. So you'd have your MIDI in that would come in. And it would head down here where it would be processed in some way through electronic circuitry. And then you would have your MIDI out that would come out here as well. But what they did to create a MIDI through port was as soon as this cable entered the jack here and entered the synthesizer, essentially what they would do is they would create a Y in that cable and immediately go out the MIDI through port, thereby bypassing the latency that occurred while all of the MIDI data and information was being processed, or these MIDI instructions were being sent to this synthesizer. You could go ahead and pass that information along, and then all three synths would produce the same sound at the same time. So now you'd have a synth configuration that looked like this, where you would have cables going from one machine, coming out of another, coming out of another, maybe going to a fourth machine that I didn't draw. So you would have this, you'd have cables coming out the MIDI out, going into the MIDI in, coming out the MIDI through, going to the MIDI in, coming out the MIDI through, back in for this final synthesizer. So out, in, and then through, so essentially you're bypassing that processing that occurs right here. Same thing here, you're coming in the in, there's the processing unit, but you send a little split or Y the cable out and go out the MIDI through. That way, all three of these synthesizers are effectively processing the data at the same time. So MIDI in, MIDI out, and MIDI through ports. To keep these MIDI cable configurations to a minimum, they also developed something called a MIDI patch bay. MIDI patch bay was a small device, and it had one MIDI in on one side, and then on the other side, it would have multiple MIDI outs. So essentially, this was a splitter box. It would split one incoming MIDI signal or cable and give the same information out multiple cables. And you'd plug it in the out jack of your MIDI keyboard, come into the MIDI patch bay, and then out to your individual synthesizers from all of these individual MIDI cables coming out of this patch bay. So it was a MIDI patch bay. Now this allowed them to actually get rid of the through ports, because you're only going out and in and back out, and there wasn't any delay because there was nothing being processed here. It's just you're essentially splitting this into 7, 8, 10 different versions or copies of the same information. You're just splitting all that information that's in the cable and duplicating it and putting out all of these additional output cables. So you come up with configurations like this as well. So that's a MIDI patch bay. Now what they were able to do, they started getting tricky and going, well, you know what? I would like to control each of these synths individually. So I want to be able to play each of these synths from this one keyboard, but I want to control all these synths individually. I don't want them all playing the same part. I want them to play individual parts. So how do I do that? Well, what they used to do is they would take and they would divide the keyboard into what you would call zones. Let's just say for our argument, C1 to C2, that's zone 1. C2 to C3 is zone 2. C3 to C4, etc. So 1, 2, 3 different zones. And now they wanted to be able to have this synth play just zone 1, this synth just play what was coming out of zone 2, or these keys, this synth just play zone 3, or what was coming out of these keys, etc. Well, luckily, the MIDI specification allowed us to do that. Allowed us to have something unique called MIDI channels. So in the MIDI specification, it allows us to have 16 separate discrete channels of information per cable. What that means in layman's terms, I've used the analogy in class, and I think it's a pretty good one. All of you in your homes have a telephone cable that runs out in front of your house underneath the ground, or it comes in from a telephone pole. And inside that telephone cable, there are many, many individual discrete telephone lines. So if I want to call and talk to somebody down the street through my cable, telephone cable, I can do that. And I'm not going to have to talk to my neighbor or somebody else next to the person I want to talk to. I can have a discrete conversation with the person that I called. And that's because they have an individual or discrete phone number. In other words, they are receiving discrete data. Only the person I call is getting the data I'm sending. A MIDI cable is like a large telephone cable. It can transmit 16 channels of discrete information to different sources. 16 different sources. Just like your telephone cable can transmit individual phone calls to individual people discreetly without hearing somebody else on another phone call. In the case of our example up here, our MIDI synthesizer, if we split it into zones, we could assign each zone a specific MIDI channel. So this is MIDI channel 1, is zone 1, this. This is MIDI, or zone 2, MIDI channel 2, MIDI channel 3, etc. And then we can go over to our synthesizer and we can tell this synthesizer, hey, I only want you to play when you hear information on channel 1. Same with this synth, I only want you to hear information coming on channel 2, channel 3, etc. And that way, even though we're only using one cable, we are sending 16 uniquely discrete channels of information over that one cable, and you can set each synthesizer to receive only one particular channel of information at a time. Great. In the next tutorial, we're going to continue our discussion and get more in depth talking about the actual MIDI specification.